Good afternoon, Michael Malice here. Let that be your welcome for the next hour. We have with us a very special guest and a very timely guest, Robert Barnes, who's an attorney at Barnes Law. And Robert has been very closely working with the Kyle Rittenhouse team. So he has a personal perspective on that situation. We're recording this on Monday, the 15th, as closing arguments are happening in that case. And I know, Robert, as well, you had a working relationship with Alex Jones. And just this morning, briefly, a judge has found in Connecticut, basically, I think was it a summary judgment found against him on behalf of the Sandy Hook families. Do you have anything to say about that situation before we move on to the Rittenhouse case?
Yeah, in the Alex Jones cases, it's really not Alex Jones that's on trial. It's the judicial system in America that is on trial because he's already been denied his due process rights, not allowed to bring an anti-SLAPP motion in Connecticut.
Can you explain what that is, an
Sure.
anti-SLAPP motion?
So the whole point of the anti-SLAPP law is to protect free speech in America, and you can't sue someone based on their speech outside of very limited circumstances. So he brought motions to dismiss on those grounds in both Texas and Connecticut. And in Connecticut, the court denied him his right to do so, just stripped it from him. The Connecticut Supreme Court heard it, issued a controversial decision that said it was okay because the grounds for the court issued was his statements outside of court that were critical of the lawyers and critical of the court system. So it was a double layer violation of free speech. And on top of that, a violation of due process rights. And this was after he had produced over 1 million pages of documents, emails, text, videos, you name it. After he had sat and other members of InfoWars had sat for days and days and days and days of deposition testimony. So then after that happens, we go to the second stage. We're supposed to have discovery. He's already produced all the discovery that could possibly be relevant in the case, sits for additional days of depositions, produces additional documents, and both the court in Austin and the court in Connecticut now have issued default judgments against him, pretending he hasn't been participating in the proceedings.
Well, I'm a little confused because what is there to have depositions about? If the case is about, from my understanding, he said things about these families that were either defamatory, libelous, whatever the situation is, what is there even to have discovery about and have depositions about?
Well, that's what was extraordinary all along. He produced more documents and more discovery and sat for more depositions of more testimony than any defendant in anti-SLAPP history. Look at the New York Times. The New York Times sat for very few depositions in the case of Project Veritas and got a complete stay on any additional discovery by the Court of Appeals pending their appeal. Whereas he produced ridiculous amounts of documents and discovery that, in my view, were not really relevant or should have had to been produced in the first place. But the courts imposed discovery obligations on him that no court in America has ever done. So it imposes invasive discovery obligations that require he disclose sources of information, disclose who he was talking to, all of that, disclose who his supporters are, you name it. And he tries to protect their privacy rights. In part of that process, it is discovered that people were illicitly sending child porn to his email addresses, trying to seed it onto his computers. That gets exposed. He gets falsely blamed for it. The media lies about that as well. And then on top of that, ultimately, they grant default judgments. He's been denied a summary judgment opportunity. He has produced far more discovery than any of the plaintiffs have in both cases. And now he's being denied a right to trial by jury. So the basic core rights of free speech, due process, and jury trial rights are being systematically and systemically denied to Alex Jones in cases that are completely unprecedented and unparalleled in American judicial history.
Isn't it the case that discovery is very strongly held not to be so-called a fishing expedition? That discovery, when it's demanded of one party or another, has to be things that are very specific and not overly broad. You can't just say, give me every communication you've ever had with anyone about a conspiracy. Like, that's the kind of thing where if it was another case, I'm not saying that's what happened here, it would be like, no, you have to ask specifically, did he talk to the parents? What, things like that. Isn't that the norm?
Absolutely. And if you look at the way institutional media defendants are treated, Rachel Maddow, for example, got a straight up dismissal for her lying about One America News Network. The New York Times is almost always able to impose strict limits on what gets discovered, what goes forward. Sarah Palin's case, strong limits on what was allowed to be discovered against the New York Times. Same as with James O'Keefe and Project Veritas. So he produced more discovery than anyone's ever been forced to produce in the history of American law in these kind of cases. And then he's denied his due process, free speech, and jury trial rights by two different state courts that are politically motivated and politically prejudiced against him.
So let's talk about the Kyle Rittenhouse case. And I'm actually very excited to talk to you about this because people are going to be surprised. I have not been following this case at all. And in fact, I'd probably be the perfect juror because everything I've heard has been secondhand. And I'm perfectly willing to ignore everything I've heard in terms of the facts of the matter. I haven't watched any of the videotapes. And in fact, I'm going to ask you questions coming at it from the most adversarial position from what I've heard. So my understanding is he killed 3 people. They were unarmed. Apparently white supremacy is somehow involved, although the people he killed were Black. He illegally, this is kind of what I'm gleaning, crossed state lines with a gun he shouldn't have had to begin with. And so that's basically, from my understanding, the worst way to frame him. How accurate is any of that? And at the same time, I'm seeing that the prosecution are making asses of themselves. They're face palming at certain points in the case, which I would think at the very least, if the case isn't going bad as an attorney, you still have to have a duty to your client or to the state to kind of put a brave face and pretend you're winning because the jury is going to watch your reaction. So it seems like there's a lot of things going on that are at the very least confusing. And let me guess that you're going to say, which it seems to be a common perspective, that it's absurd that this even became a case.
It's definitely absurd it ever became a case. So I was involved in the case up until a week before trial when the defense team decided not to involve a lot of people in the jury selection process that I had brought to the table. So I withdrew because I thought we needed real robust jury selection because of what you just articulated. The pretrial publicity was so prejudicial to Kyle in Kenosha that a majority of Kenoshans presumed him guilty before the trial started based on facts that would be proven false at trial. So, for example, Kyle never crossed state lines with a gun. His mom did not drive him to secure the property at Car Source that night that he was employed to do. The gun he legally had. In Wisconsin, as a 17-year-old, you are legally entitled to possess and carry a rifle.
Wait, let me interrupt you. Where did this happen and why was he there?
So what happened in Kenosha, the context of this was this, I think as the Seattle mayor called it, the summer of love. This was a summer of riotous conduct all across the country by people that were criminal sociopaths using the guise and disguise of BLM protests to infiltrate those protests. And in my view, effectively discredit those protests by engaging in looting, arson, assaults, attacks on people, property across the nation. Kenosha is a very middle America town right between Chicago and Milwaukee. Ethnic hodgepodge of people, 10% Italian, 10% Polish, about a third German, about 10% Mexican American, about 5% African American in terms of the voting population. Slightly voted for Trump, but historically has been a labor Democratic community, big auto manufacturing area for a long time. But it like in 1945, you could find an old documentary that said Kenosha, welcome to America's town.
Yeah.
So very middle America. They are not accustomed to riots. So Jacob Blake was shot in a controversial incident with police. Ultimately, the police were cleared in the shooting because he had a knife and was going for it at the time. And but because of the shooting, the media narrative was Black man shot 7 times in the back by police. And so that unleashed initially BLM protests, but then those were very quickly infiltrated by a wide range of criminal sociopaths with long criminal records who used it to do attacks on people, do attacks on property, a lot of arson, a lot of looting, a lot of attacks. In particular, there was a Car Source was the name of a company that had a bunch of cars. Their cars were torched night after night after night. So Kyle Rittenhouse, whose entire family, for the most part, comes from Kenosha, he lived in Antioch, which is a bedroom community of Kenosha. It is to Kenosha what, say, Arlington, Virginia is to DC.
Yeah.
So he his best friends live there. He worked in Kenosha. He's a lifeguard in Kenosha. People ask him, what happens is the Car Source people ask people to come help them. And so he had friends that were going to be employed that night, and they asked him to come along to help protect the property from further arson and damage.
So to be clear, it wasn't even preemptive. It was, we've already been attacked and had our property destroyed, and there's no reason to doubt this isn't going to happen again.
Exactly. They just didn't want their buildings to go up in flames as well. Their over $2 million of damage had been done.
But Robert, they have insurance. This is the voice of the unheard, right?
That is what they had discovered, was that there was no insurance for this. There's no
Oh,
insurance for
wow.
civil unrest, no insurance for arson. So insurance wasn't going to cover all their damage. They could have been bankrupted and out of business. And this is a minority immigrant owned business. Many of
Okay.
the businesses being attacked that night in Kenosha were either minority or immigrant owned. So that was the other irony. In the guise of BLM protest, infiltrated by sociopaths, they were busy destroying minority owned businesses and immigrant owned businesses in the name of civil liberties and civil rights. The police basically functionally withdraw because they can't handle the situation. And then the governor refuses to send in the National Guard. So you had blocks and blocks and blocks they knew that night were going to be completely unguarded and completely unprotected.
Wait,
They
so
had
why did, can I, let me ask you, why did the governor decide not to send the National Guard given all this unrest?
Very interesting. It was a Democratic governor who, this was during the whole summer, where Democratic politicians were pretending the riots weren't happening, or they wanted the riots to happen and blame them on Trump. That's my interpretation. Other people can. I've yet to hear the governor give a justification for what he did
Okay.
and why he did it.
Okay. Wow.
And so basically, so that's what happened. So Kyle is someone who's trained in arms, who had police training. He goes back and forth as a kid between being a cop, a fireman, or a nurse, which gives you an idea. His idea for being a cop is not about power. It's about how do you protect people? How do you help people? That's why he goes back and forth between being a fireman and a nurse. And so he had basic training in terms of being able to save people and treat people from his lifeguard training and from his police academy, young teenager training, police patrols, they called it. And he was trained in an AR-15 that was purchased by his friend that he was going to legally own once he turned 18. But in Wisconsin, he could legally possess once he was 17. So he goes out there with a bunch of other people to protect the
Wait, I got
crossroads.
I got to interrupt because you're going so fast, and I'm completely ignorant about this. So let me just clarify this. This claim that he had no right to have that gun is completely untrue.
Was always completely false. And this morning, the judge dismissed the charge with prejudice. So
Okay.
he said there was no grounds for it because he's legally entitled to carry a rifle as a 17-year-old in Wisconsin.
Okay. So I didn't understand that also. So you're telling me that the prosecutor tried to get him on guns charges, even though very clearly, legally, he had a right to possess that arm and was on the road to legally becoming the owner of that weapon once he became 18.
That's exactly right.
Okay,
And
so I sorry, but just I think what people need to appreciate, because conservatives have historically had a respect for law and order, they don't appreciate to what extent prosecutors are perfectly willing to throw whatever they can at you in the hopes of getting a plea, because their job as a prosecutor is to prosecute and get you to break. And isn't this not a very common prosecutorial technique to just throw you as many charges you can to kind of make the person feel overwhelmed? So rather than playing Russian roulette where you've got 5 bullets in 6 chambers, you're just going to cop to whatever plea that they want just to make it go away.
absolutely. What the conservatives in America are being educated through the Rittenhouse case, like some other cases, the January 6 cases, Russiagate, the treatment of Trump, that how corrupt the American judicial system is. And it's something that the left used to be complaining about. Now, ironically, they're complicit in supporting and endorsing it because of their statist ideology and idolatry. But the nature of it is this prosecutor is emblematic of the degree to which Kyle Rittenhouse, normally without public support, is a poor kid from a poor family who would have been crushed by the system. They would have illegally, they would have detained him because he wouldn't have been able to post a $2 million bail. He would have been stuck in jail. Someone who's never experienced that, who was the target of criminal sociopaths that night. So you can imagine how he would be targeted. In fact, people on the left are celebrating on Twitter the day he gets raped in prison. It's sad and pitiful and disgraceful where the civil liberties left has devolved to in America. But that's what happens when statism infiltrates your ideas and you become basically you treat the state as your idol. That's the inevitable and inescapable outcome. But conservatives equally are getting a rapid education on how corrupt our judicial system is, particularly from a prosecutorial perspective. And this prosecutor's been emblematic of that across the board. He's lied about Kyle routinely in bail proceedings and pretrial evidentiary proceedings for the sole purpose of inflaming the court of public opinion, because the press knows if a prosecutor lies in the court record, they're completely immune if they repeat those lies in the press. And the prosecutor's completely immune because he lied in the court proceedings. So they routinely, like all these things that people believe, crossing state lines, having a gun illegally, doing evasive activities, having no right to be there that night. All of those are lies based on what the prosecutor has pitched and pushed in through the court of a public opinion, accusing him of racism when he has mixed race relatives. I mean, there's no history when he was protecting minority owned businesses that night.
But he didn't kill any minority. The people he killed were white. Is that not correct?
Completely white sociopaths who were using racist language all night long. The people not only was he defending minority-owned businesses, he was the people he had the attackers he had to defend himself against were on tape using the N-word repeatedly all night long to a wide range of people while disguised as a BLM protest. And the people that by the way, there are only 2 people died, a third person was shot.
Okay.
But survived. But all of them are criminal sociopaths with a long history of criminal behavior. One of them, Rosenbaum, was a pedophile, long history of abusive conduct, was on a temporary restraining order criminally for assaulting and threatening his girlfriend. Had just been released from a mental hospital for repeated suicide attempts.
Wait, but you're skimming over a part, because when you say pedophile, this guy sexually assaulted a child. This isn't like he was just sending texts via AOL to someone inappropriately. He put his hands on a child and sexually assaulted the kid, at least one.
Yes, exactly, and there may have been multiple. So I mean, that's who you're dealing with. You're dealing with a suicidal sociopath who was lighting fires all night long, making threats all night long, promising that if he got Kyle alone, he would kill him.
Okay.
And then another person, Joshua Zeminski, who was complicit in all of this, long criminal history, being prosecuted for arson currently for what he did that night. Anthony Huber, long criminal history, threats to his own family members. That's how severe his criminal behavior was. Attacked Kyle twice and as the unarmed, all 3 people were armed. Just
okay.
In a different way. So Rosenbaum, when you grab somebody else's gun, you're armed legally because you have responsibility for what then happens to that gun, even if you don't get full possession of it. Both Anthony Huber and Jacob Rosenbaum were only shot by Kyle when they were in the process of grabbing his gun.
Here, guys, we all want to make sure our family's protected in a medical emergency. And what many of us don't realize is that health insurance won't always cover the full amount of an emergency medical flight. Even with comprehensive coverage, you get hit with high deductibles and copays. That's why an AirMed Care Network membership is so important. As a member, if there's an emergency, you won't see a bill for air medical transport when flown by an AMCN provider. And best of all, a membership covers your entire household for as little as $85 a year. That's practically nothing. AMCN providers are called upon to transport more than 100,000 patients a year. This is coverage no family should be without. And now, as a listener of our show, you'll get up to a $50 e-gift card with a new membership. All you have to do is go to airmedcarenetwork.com/malice and use offer code Malice. Hey guys, Michael Malice here. I want to talk to you about one of my favorite sponsors, which is Fume. If you go to breathefume.com/malice, breathefum.com/malice, and use promo code Malice10, you get 10% off your order. What are you getting? You're getting a fume, which is made out of wood, and it's a great replacement for your hands if you're a smoker or a vapor. No smoke, no moving parts, no nicotine, no harmful chemicals. What they do is they have a little core, which is filled with the powers of the world super plants. You stick at the end, you can have a beer, hang out at a party. You're going to have a way to wean yourself off of cigarettes and nicotine, and it's going to taste great, and it works to curb cravings, ease stress, and improve breathing. And it looks like a steampunk vape. It's made of Canadian wood. It looks really, really cool. Now they have a new Quit Naturally pack. You get 1 fume and 4 packs of cores studied to curb cravings and get you on the path to being nicotine-free. You owe it to yourself to have your health better. And the easiest way they found to quit smoking is by these halfway measures instead of going cold turkey. If you go cold turkey, more power to you. Not a lot of people can do that. If you go to breathefume.com/malice and use promo code Malice10, you're going to be healthier starting tomorrow. Let's get back to the show. Okay, break this down for me, because this almost seems to be hard for me to wrap my head around because I'm not a lunatic. They go to this place where Kyle is with, I'm guessing, some other people. They see that he is armed and they go to grab his gun.
Yeah. So what happens is at one point during the night, they start lighting fires at a third. This car source company had 3 locations.
Okay.
At this third car source location, Kyle goes down with a fire extinguisher to put it out. He'd been putting out fires throughout the night. Indeed, they were lighting dumpsters on fire, and they claim they were aiming them at the police vehicles. But if you look at where they were aiming it, it more likely appears they were aiming it at a gas station.
Wait, I'm sorry. They admit that they're lighting fires, but they're saying, no, 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 we wanted to light the cops on fire, not the car company. That was their argument.
Yeah, not the car company, and worse yet, not the gas station.
Okay.
Because if they had gone to the gas station, of course, and hit the fuel lines, then it's a huge explosion.
Yeah.
They really wanted, this was supposed to be the peak of sort of criminal purge time
Okay.
for this class of people. And Kyle looks like not only 17-year-old, he's 17 who looks 12.
Right.
You know, he's got a Michael J. Fox, big eyes. So for criminal sociopaths, he's exactly the kind of person they want to target.
Okay.
He'd been a medic that night. He'd gone out and helped people throughout the night. And that enraged them even more. So at one point, there's fires going on at a third location. He runs down with a fire extinguisher to get it. What he doesn't know until he arrives is there's an ambush waiting for him between these two different individuals, including Rosenbaum, who's seated behind. You can see him on the video behind two cars waiting for Kyle to come by, and then runs behind him. Because of various reasons, Kyle got separated from everyone else. So he's by himself here. And there's a group of about 100 people in front of him behind a bunch of cars who are damaging the cars and lighting fires. So he's by himself, surrounded now by a hostile crowd. He drops the fire extinguisher and says, friendly, friendly, friendly. At that point, Zeminski, one of the other people involved, makes a threat against him. And his girlfriend says, get him. And he turns and sees Rosenbaum running right at him. So he tries to run across the parking lot. He hears a gunshot behind him. It's Zeminski.
Wait, so he fled. It's not right. It's not like the first moment he took his gun and started shooting.
No,
he retreated.
He tries
to
flee twice. He first tries to back up and get up towards where his friends are, but he can't because there's other people blocking him. And he sees Rosenbaum coming at him and kind of trapping him. So he figures, I'll just run across the lot. He runs across the lot. As he's running across the lot, he hears a gunshot behind his head. Turns around, sees Rosenbaum still running at him, and points the gun briefly at Rosenbaum, thinking Rosenbaum will then stop. But Rosenbaum doesn't, keeps running at him. So he turns and tries to run out through the side of the parking lot between some cars. But as he gets to the cars, he sees a massive crowd looking and waiting for him. And he doesn't know where the gunshot came from. Right. So he doesn't know if they're waiting for him as well. So he turns around, and as he turns around, as Richie McGinnis, who was a Daily Caller reporter, was right behind this, watching it happen, Rosenbaum, who had previously told him he would kill him if he got him alone, says, screaming.
Told him where? In what context? Like, when did they talk earlier?
So Rosenbaum was doing this throughout the crowd, throughout the night.
Okay.
So it's not just Kyle he threatens.
Okay, got it.
But Kyle's part of a crowd where he says, I get you alone, you're effing dead. You're effing dead. And so Kyle turns around and sees Rosenbaum. And as Richie McGinnis testified, Rosenbaum screams a blood-curdling scream, F you, that you can hear on the tape from way far away, and lunges for the gun. At that point is when Kyle shoots. Now, it's an AR-15, so 4 rounds go off in less than a second. Rosenbaum drops. Kyle goes around, comes back to look at Rosenbaum to see what's happening, picks up a phone to call someone who can help, the first number on the line, which is his friend. And as he's doing it, people start screaming, that boy shot somebody, get him, cranium him. In other words, right through the head.
Yeah.
So at that point, and then they start running at him. So he turns around and tries to run down the street as he's towards the police, trying to get to the police line. Tells people, I'm trying to get to the police line, including one of the people that is later attacks him. As he's running down, people are coming behind him and hitting him in the head.
Oh my gosh.
Nothing.
Okay. I did not know that. Okay.
He doesn't turn around and shoot. Nothing. He's staggering forward. He keeps trying to run forward. As he's running forward, finally somebody comes from behind and hits him with a skateboard over the head.
Oh my God. Okay.
Knocks him down to the ground. As he's knocked down to the ground, one person comes and tries to jump kick him in the head. As he shoots in the air, and that person runs away.
Okay.
Not hurt, but he's charged with reckless endangerment for that individual.
Okay.
Then the person who hit him with the skateboard is Anthony Huber, comes at him a second time with the skateboard to bash him in the head. Partially hits him. In fact, the evidence is clear that he had probably a severe concussion at this point.
Okay.
As Huber jumps over him, because the second hit on the head with the skateboard didn't kill Kyle, Huber tries to grab the gun. At that point of him grabbing the gun, Kyle shoots him once. He dies. At that point, a third person comes at him, Gabe Grosquitz, who comes up to him and first feigns, hey, I'm okay. Kyle looks, sees that he's saying his hands are up, puts his gun right down. Then Grosskreutz grabs his Glock and points it right at Kyle's head. At that point, he shoots him in the arm. Doesn't follow up and shoot him any further. staggers up, gets to the police line, and that's the end of the events as relevant to the case.
That's and my understanding is this is all on video, correct? So this
Yes,
isn't
every
like
single bit of that is video, and there's been multiple witnesses, independent journalists who've all testified to those same set of facts, independent witnesses who've testified to those same set of facts, including the state's own witnesses.
wait. The state put up witnesses that undermine their own case?
Yes. Yes.
Isn't it the job of a prosecutor before I put someone on the stand to get a debriefing or whatever the term would be legally to understand what this person's perspective is so that when I put him on the stand, I'm not going to be ambushed and made a fool of?
My overall ethically, a prosecutor's actual job is to do justice.
Yeah,
So
right.
A truly ethical prosecutor would put up all the evidence, good or bad. Now, as a practical matter, there's very few prosecutors who understand what that ethical mandate means. And this prosecutor, who's been colloquially called Little Binger after Littlefinger from the Game of Thrones, appropriately, his name is Binger, he put these witnesses up because I think he knew the defense was going to put them up. So he tried to mitigate the harm by controlling their testimony.
Okay.
These are their own witnesses. Like Richie McGinnis is listed as a victim in the case, that Kyle recklessly endangered, the allegation recklessly endangered Richie McGinnis by shooting at Rosenbaum. McGinnis said otherwise. In fact, one of the most memorable moments from the trial was Binger, the prosecutor, was trying to get Richie McGinnis to back off his testimony about what Rosenbaum did. And at one point he said, so you don't have any idea what was going on in Rosenbaum's head at the time he was shot, right? And Richie McGinnis said, other than him screaming F you and trying to grab the gun.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So it was defining. In fact, the state also put up Gabe Grosskreutz, who admitted on cross-examination that, that Kyle didn't shoot him at all when he put his hands up, and that Kyle only shot him when he went and got his gun, grabbed it, and pointed it right at Kyle's head.
Wait, I'm sorry. This is because everything I've heard has been so comical, like on Twitter and social media. I've been assuming I'm missing something. The guy that Kyle shot admitted on the stand that he pointed his gun at Kyle and he worked in effect to defend Kyle against the charges against him.
Yes. And then he went on media the next day and lied about what he had said in the trial. But it's right on trial where he admits, so when your hands are up, Kyle doesn't shoot you. That's correct. In fact, Kyle doesn't shoot until you get your gun, pull it out, and point it right at his head. Yes, correct.
Well, can you help me understand from the prosecutor's point of view why they're trying to make such a big case out of Kyle? How does this benefit them?
Because if they can convict Kyle, there is no real self-defense left in America.
Okay.
This is a highly, heavily political case, because it's already a problem that we give the state a monopolized means on certain means of violence, of mass violence. Imagine if the state then has a monopoly on the use of violence, period. Self-defense is the one counterbalance to that. Gun rights are one of the key counterbalance to that. If you are a statist at core, you want to take away self-defense and you want to take away gun rights. You want to make, for example, today, the prosecutor actually made the argument in closing argument that Kyle even bringing a gun denied him his rights of self-defense. He actually used a meme from Roadhouse saying that if you bring a gun to a fist fight, you don't have self-defense. In other words, if you use a gun to defend yourself, you don't have self-defense unless the other party also has a gun, which has never, of course, been the law. When you have a kid this innocent, on this clean, he has no criminal record of any kind. Again, on these.
Wait, I'm sorry, I got to interrupt you because sounds so crazy to me. Even like being familiar with like North Korean ideology. A woman's in her house, guy breaks in to rape her with a knife, and she shoots him. Right? Is it the prosecution's perspective from what they're saying in this case that she should go to jail?
Yes, correct. And by the way, in Kenosha, they are prosecuting a woman who defended herself against a sexual assault case and killed her attacker. So that's also happening very controversially in Kenosha. So that gives an idea of how politically weaponized the system has become. Because if they can convict a kid like Kyle on facts like these in a place like Kenosha,
with the video, this is not hearsay. This is not, I saw one thing, you saw another thing. This is all on video, right? Okay.
Exactly. Undisputed, incontroverted testimony from both video witnesses, video evidence that's come in, and from the state's own witnesses, That's what they want to do. They want to show you're not allowed to bring only the state. What they're really saying is only the state can use violence, lethal violence.
So is the legal theory that once you bring a gun, which you are legally allowed to do according to Second Amendment and in Kenosha, anything that happens to you after that, it's too bad?
Yes. Effectively, you can't use the gun to defend yourself. He even made the argument that if your gun is bigger than the other guys, you can't use the gun to defend yourself. Because he has the problem with Grosskreutz had a gun and pointed at Kyle's head. But he's like, oh, but that's a small gun and your gun is big.
Wait, that was really
yes.
Like a Glock?
Yes.
Isn't a Glock is not some kind of lady purse gun.
Exactly. But that was his actual cross-examination of Kyle Rittenhouse on the stand.
How can you explain to me how his, I mean, I almost know the answer, but I just want to hear you say it as an attorney. How is it that his bail was set at $2 million?
It was only because in that prior case that I mentioned, or the other case that I mentioned, the woman who defended herself against a history of sexual assault by killing the person who'd been sexually abusing her for years, she got $2 million bail. So they used that as the pretext to get it here. There were some mistakes made by his early defense team. There was a guy named John Pierce who's very problematic as a criminal defense lawyer, who fought extradition needlessly from Illinois that may have facilitated the high amount of bail. But it's also the other problem in Wisconsin. That's a pure cash bail. So you can't get a bails bondsman to post $200,000 for you. You have to come up with the full $2 million for dollar. Luckily, so many people were outraged by the prosecution of Kyle that they raised the money to post his bail. Otherwise, he would have been sitting in jail for over a year.
Did they at any point try to offer him a plea deal, if you know?
No plea deal was ever offered in the case.
Is that I got to tell you, like, I'm kind of stunned hearing you break this down, because even given me and my anarchist background, I wanted to assume that it wasn't as egregious as I've been hearing. I have a good friend of mine, and he was telling me he was getting so upset watching this case that he was actually punching the pillow. And I'm like, I mean, the people he killed were even George Floyd, right? George Floyd had a criminal record, but in that moment, he wasn't assaulting Derek Chauvin. He wasn't assaulting the woman. You know, he's passing counterfeit money. He wasn't beating up the woman at CVS, something like that. These are a child rapist and a violent criminal who were threatening him, who actually had hit him in the head with a lethal weapon. You can hit someone that had enough time to skateboard, they're going to die, or at least their head's going to get cracked open. That's not a dispute. Another one pointed a gun at him, and they're being portrayed as somehow like beatified victims here.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, is this something that in your legal experience is common?
No. And other prosecutors have acknowledged that 99 out of 100 prosecutors would not have brought this case. It's because there were two things that really agitated them. It's kind of my theory for why the Proud Boys ended up getting targeted and I think infiltrated by some bad actors too. I've warned Gavin of this from the get-go, but you know, Gavin is Gavin.
Yeah.
So is that they want to control the streets. Like the reaction to the Tea Party was Occupy Wall Street. And an aspect of that was legitimate, and an aspect of it was politically infiltrated for ulterior purposes. And it's like street theater of the 1930s, where the communists and the fascists believed if you controlled the streets, you controlled the country, you controlled the community. So they believe, and that's why the anti-fascists are trying to reimagine themselves as those 1930s communists doing the same thing to pretend Nazis. But they need Nazis just as the Nazis needed communists in order to justify their street theater. So they were partially they're enraged that anybody undermined the street theater of the riotous violence, which is partially what Kyle exposed that night. But the other part is they've never liked self-defense. The statist left, and they've never liked the Second Amendment. And in my view, the Second Amendment fundamentally, as the Supreme Court has acknowledged, isn't primarily about gun rights. It's primarily about the right of self-defense.
Isn't it primarily about the right to shoot the government when it gets out of hand?
Both. In other words, it's empowering the individual against the state with the ultimate means. Because what's the ultimate form of individual power? The power of self-defense for your own survival against the state or anyone else. And in particular, it's a right as opposed to the state. In other words, the state doesn't get to have a monopoly on the use of violence. And they've always been offended by that. The statists left. And so Rittenhouse sat at the centerpiece of both exposing the riots, undermining the ability of the riotous left to control the streets for street theater purposes, for political purposes. And at the same time, if they could take them out, they could deeply undermine self-defense and Second Amendment rights and give the state its ultimate power, which is the power of an exclusive monopoly on not only the mass means of mass violence, but the exclusive monopoly on the right of violence, period. That's why this case was so important to them to get a prosecution, because if they could convict this kid in these circumstances in Kenosha, they can convict anybody, anywhere, anytime.
You guys ever feel like you're being followed around on the internet? Maybe advertisers know but too much about you. So our sponsor, IPVanish VPN, helps you take back your privacy and become anonymous on the internet. It's a virtual private network, which is a VPN for short. It's an important tool that helps you safely browse the internet. What a VPN does, you can use in your computer, tablet, phone, anything. When you use a VPN, your data is encrypted. What you're reading, what you're searching, you know what I'm talking about, what you're watching, whatever it is you're doing. And that's important because what you're doing on the internet is no one's business but yours. Certainly not my business. For listening to the show, IPVanish is offering 65% off their annual plan. It's only $3.75 a month. Super easy to use. Turn on with one click. It runs in the background. Protects you while you're browsing the web. If you run into a problem, you boomers, no problem. You can have 24/7 support by email, chat, and telephone. All you got to do is go to ipvanish.com/malice and use promo code malice, MALICE, to claim your 65% off savings. Their annual plan is just $44.99 for a year with our discount, and they're the best of the best. Rated 4.7 out of 5 on Trustpilot with more than 6,000 reviews. ipvanish.com/malice to get the deal and start protecting your anonymity online. Hey guys, we got a very different kind of sponsor for this episode. It's called The Jordan Harbinger Show. It's a podcast you really should be listening to. And I know that every day somebody tells you just have to listen to podcasts. They never say mine because they're smart. And you nod and say, yeah, sure. Cool story, bro. Don't let that happen here. Jordan Show, Apple named it one of the best of 2018, is aimed at making you a better informed, more critical thinker so you get a sense of how the world works and come to your own conclusions about what's happening, even inside your own brain. Each episode is a convo with a different guest. And when I say there's something for everyone here, I mean it. In one episode, he talks to a hostage negotiator from the FBI. Another episode, he's talking to a cinematographer who just discovered a lost city in the jungle and made one of the most important archaeological finds of the century. This is food for the brain. You're really going to enjoy this. If you search for The Jordan Harbinger Show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts, you're going to be in for a treat. You go to jordanharbinger.com/subscribe, jordanharbinger.com/iTunes. And to learn more about Jordan, jordanharbinger.com/about. Let's get back to the show. Well, I have a few thoughts. First of all, I'm very heartened that conservative, very frequently prosecutors go on to become Republican, like mayors or state senators or governors or things like that. And I think conservatives and prosecutors have historically, kind of had this buddy relationship. So I'm gratified that conservatives and people from all political stripes are coming to the realization that prosecutors are political actors. And sometimes political actors, like any politician, are going to do what you want them to, but their main priority is going to be their ambition. And if you are in the way of their ambition, they have no problem, if you're a kid, destroying you. And a good example of this, you and I are boomers and ancient. We're old enough to remember that when the Monica Lewinsky story first broke, she was 21, 22, this silly intern at the White House. She's the kid. All the news channels trotted out Clinton operatives, and they all said she's a stalker and she's got to screw loose. And if anyone, it's Bill Clinton, who should be scared because this kid is stalking the president and she's out of her mind. And if it wasn't for that dress, that would still historically have been the case, that this kid who was a threat to the presidency would have had her life ruined and would have gone down in history as a deranged stalker of Bill Clinton. So it's someone's age, or doesn't matter who they are. If you stand in the way of the state and its edicts, they will have no qualms absolutely crushing you and then peeing on your grave.
Exactly. I mean, a true conservative should recognize the populist principle that any power you give to the state is power that will inevitably and inescapably be misused and abused against you. And that's why as much power to the individual as possible, and as limited a role of the state in general. And the problem is conventional conservatives has only been focused on that as it applied to private corporations,
Right.
whereas they needed to apply it more importantly to ordinary everyday individuals. And that's why this case is so critical. And the fact that normally a poor kid in this system would have been crushed. Kyle would have been jailed, would have been likely convicted, everything else, but for the public coming to his defense and people on the right starting to wake up to the problem of our criminal justice system and the problem of affording the state any amount of power in this area without limits, without controls, without discipline.
I have a friend, Eliza Orleans, who has been a guest on the show, and she's a very hard leftist, but I admire her enormously because she worked for the public DA. And basically her job was to help people who were destitute and whatever, to kind of defend them as best as she could. And there's no question, and she admitted that many of the people she's defending were criminals and were guilty of this. But much of her role, and I don't want to put words in her mouth, but my understanding is much of the role of these public defenders is to tell them, take the plea, because the person has no resources. They're regarded as very weak. The jury's probably not going to look kindly on them necessarily. At the same time, you're against the state, which has unlimited resources. And if I, as a prosecutor, I'm investing my time and money, my office into prosecuting you, I better get something out of it as a result of this. So I'm just going to do whatever I can to break you, because now that you're in my crosshairs, like the Eye of Sauron, it's my role to make sure, it's like how cops have quotas. It's like, I got to fill these cells somehow. And it's my job to, if you're the one I caught, well, good luck to you, because I'm a lot stronger than you. And I'm sure a lot smarter than you and more educated when it comes to the law.
And the state will keep arrogating power to itself. The more abuses it gets away with, the more abuses it will do. Like in this case, you had a prosecutor lie about Kyle, create all kinds of pretrial prejudice through pretrial publicity, through false filings in court. Not only that, witnesses testified that the prosecutors tried to suborn perjury from him. This was independent witness. There are other witnesses. The car source owners clearly committed perjury on the stand. The prosecutor had to have known it, so he effectively suborned perjury in the trial itself. Illicitly commented on Kyle taking the Fifth Amendment prior to his testimony, which is a patent Fifth Amendment violation and has been for 50 years, which should have been a mistrial with prejudice and dismissal.
Can you break down what that means, what the Fifth Amendment is, and how it's? I mean, we all know what it is, but how is it used, and is it, and so on and so forth.
So to have a robust Fifth Amendment right means you have a right to remain silent. It means more than that. In my view, there's aspects of it that are not still being properly applied by the Supreme Court, which is that it's a right not to be a witness against yourself, period, which to me should apply to identification exams and handwriting examples and physical exams and all the rest. But they acknowledge that it completely applies to any testimonial aspect. And part of that is the prosecutor cannot comment on that at all. He can never comment that you, in any adverse way, that you were silent at any time during the entire criminal trial or up to the criminal trial.
Right. So, it's not, if I say, I'm going to invoke my Fifth Amendment, you can't say, aha, he's guilty. He invoked the Fifth Amendment, because then you effectively are being a witness against yourself.
Exactly. You can't comment adversely on him being silent. So you don't even have to take the Fifth. If the defendant has been silent, you can't comment on that either, because that's protected by the Fifth Amendment. One of his very first questions to Kyle Rittenhouse on the stand was, isn't it the case that basically you've been silent up until now, and commenting adversely on that? And that has been determined by the U.S. Supreme Court for over half a century to be a patent Fifth Amendment violation. The court had ordered him not to go into certain evidentiary issues that didn't matter. He did that too on cross-examination. So it's been routine, repeated violations. In both his opening statement and closing argument, he made false statements of fact, made false statements about the law. All of this is sanctionable conduct. And it shows that what the world is waking up to, including many people on the right, is how regular and routine prosecutorial misconduct is. They normally get away with it because it's not on TV.
Right.
They normally get away with it because it's some politically disliked individual who's the defendant. And that's why it's critical to defend everybody's rights, because once they get accustomed to violating anyone's rights, your rights are next.
Yeah, it's like kind of like the Patriot Act, which was one of the great conservative nightmares of all time. The idea is like, look, we all have to give up a little bit of our freedom so that everyone can be safe. The same thing with the lockdowns. But what ends up happening is we never end up somehow being safe. That threat is always dangled over us. And that little bit of freedom becomes a lot more because then it gets built on and it never gets repealed or restored to normal. It's this ratchet effect. And you see it clearly as night follows day.
Exactly. And I've always said you're not safe if you're not free.
Right. Yeah, of course. Yeah. So there's a few actually, let's talk about gun rights because there's a few white pills that have happened that I think many people aren't aware of. So much of our focus politically is on Washington and the federal government, but state by state have done great things in order to secure gun rights and people's right to self-defense. One of the things that I think is a story that hasn't been told enough is the promulgation of castle doctrine across America and how that's become normalized very quietly. But this is just a wonderful thing. Can you explain to people what castle doctrine is?
Absolutely. So it's a right that you don't have a duty to retreat. You have a right to protect your home. If somebody invades your home, you have a right to assume they have bad intent. If they invade your car, you have a right to assume bad intent and can defend yourself accordingly. So in Wisconsin, it's very robust. So, for example, normally there's no duty to retreat in Wisconsin. Now, one of the mistakes the defense made during the Rittenhouse case is they allowed in a bunch of crazy evidence. They allowed super chats to be introduced into evidence. They allowed video commentary from YouTubers to be introduced into evidence because they were just very careless at what video evidence they admitted or didn't object to. And the net effect of that was the court allowed the prosecution to argue provocation, and it's only in instances of provocation that you have a duty to retreat. Otherwise, under the Castle Doctrine and in Wisconsin, you have no duty to retreat, period, generally.
Oh, so provocation meaning you and I arguing, I shove you, and then you kind of get violent with me. Okay, got it. Okay.
Exactly. And the problem here was the real interpretation of provocation that they're doing, that a lot of liberals and statists support and that they're advocating for in Rittenhouse's case, is that merely going to protect property was provocative. You know there's a riot going on. What are you doing down there trying to protect property?
Oh, it's look how he was dressed. He was asking for it. Is that basically the argument?
That is absolutely the argument. He has a gun. He has no business with a gun. What's a kid doing with a gun in the middle of a riot? That's provocative to those poor rioters, those poor criminal sociopaths.
Wait. I'm sorry. If I'm rioting and I'm burning down buildings and so on and so forth, and I see someone with a gun, I would think that's not going to provoke me to aggress against that person. It's going to provoke me to set a fire somewhere else.
Exactly. In fact, that night was the least violent night in Kenosha. And why? It was because there are a bunch of armed men there and that they decided, oh, maybe we're not going to light so many fires tonight. Maybe we're not going to destroy as much property tonight. Maybe we're not going to. I mean, there was a furniture salesman who had the furniture store owner who had the crap kicked out of him in the night before. That didn't happen only because of the people that were there. If Kyle had not been there that night, I have no doubt there would have been much worse violence against people and property because you had some of your worst criminal sociopaths come down that night for their version of fun. But basically, they're arguing if you defend yourself against purge night, you're the criminal. And that was the mindset and mentality they've actually adopted. And they're loosely calling it provocation, that it was provocative to even be there, provocative to even have a gun, provocative to even point the gun towards anyone who was threatening you. Provocative to defend property. In fact, the prosecutor in its closing suggested it was provocative to be there if you didn't support BLM and Jacob Blake. I mean, that's how insane it was. And that's the kind of, it's ideological conformity night. Anybody who doesn't conform is being provocative to the crowd, is being provocative to the mob.
But it's also kind of like defending a car. It's not like a car dealership has a particular political stance. If you're defending cars from being burned, that's nothing to do with BLM one way or another. You said, I want to try to present the prosecution's case as strongly as possible because this is so out of its mind to me that I'm having difficulty trying to digest it. You had said that the people who owned the car dealership perjured themselves and were on the stand against Kyle. Explain that to me, because if he's defending the dealership, one would think that they'd be defending him.
The problem they have is once a shooting happened on their property, if they hired people that were not professionally certified security guards, they could be sued for wrongful death.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
And so they suddenly decided, we don't know any of these people. Yes, we're in photos with them. Yes, there's
wait. Sorry, I got to interrupt you. They testified that they didn't know the people who were defending that these are just vigilantes who decided to defend a car dealership.
Correct. Even though there were several of them that had been long-term employees of them, even though they're in photographs smiling with them on the night in question with all of them armed. even though there was testimony that they received text confirming their employment, even though there was testimony they actually drove them between locations, even though there was testimony from multiple state witnesses that they had been hired that night, they actually got on the stand and pretended they had no idea what these kids were. They just saw some people with guns and stood for a photo just because they thought those are interesting outfits, and otherwise had no idea what they were doing that night. And not only that, it was clear by their testimony that they have some interesting tax and financial structuring issues at issue, because they're like, well, maybe I work there. I kind of work there. Maybe I don't work there. In other words, they're playing like the mom apparently owns one business and the dad owns another. You probably do that for the mom to get some small business loans based on being a woman-owned business. But they were playing a lot of games about what their role. The inventory manager testified he didn't know how much damage had been done. He didn't know how many cars had been destroyed.
Right.
Stuff like that.
What has been the reaction in the legal community as a result of this case? Are there actually a large number of people who are defending this prosecution?
Yes. I mean, Joe Scarborough still is. I mean, and still lying about Kyle in the process. Ben and Jerry's was busy lying yesterday. Ben and Jerry's ice cream. They're going to need to invent a new ice cream and call it libel, because they actually went out and said Kyle crossed state lines with gun. Provably false at this point. Completely false.
I'm confused as to why that's an issue. Okay. If I cross state lines with a gun, right, and someone pulls a Glock at me or someone hits me over the head with a skateboard and I defend myself, maybe I could have a gun trafficking charge. Like, I'm just trying to theoretically, but in terms of murder or self-defense, of what relevance is that in that situation?
It never had any relevance.
Okay.
In fact, it was I call it confession through projection. When somebody accuses you of something totally wacky, just listen to them and they'll be confessing their own crimes. And media's done that a lot. There were people really crossing state lines, as in from Seattle to Kenosha.
Okay, yeah.
And Portland to Kenosha, but it was some of the rioters and the looters and the arsonists that night. And they basically, if you listen to the prosecutor, he took everything Antifa and other hardcore riotous leftists were doing and projected onto Kyle. So you take all the traits of what Antifa types were doing that night. He pretended Kyle's that person, had crossing state lines with a gun, touring for chaos, trying to create violence, trying to provoke violence. That's what the left was doing. That's why they're doing it day after day after day. And he projected it on Kyle to try to shift accountability and responsibility. And so it's part of the broader narrative that he's been telling.
And again, I'm sorry, I just got to ask you again. There were several times during that night when Kyle, who was armed, did in fact retreat.
Oh, yes. He retreated all night long. The only time he ever pulls the trigger, I've had military people reach out to me and say that they know 20-year soldiers not exercise the self-discipline that Kyle did that night. I mean, people are bashing him over the head and he doesn't turn around to shoot at anybody. A guy just pointed a gun at him. He only shoots him in the arm. He doesn't follow up at all. He just turns around and walks away. So he doesn't fire on Rosenbaum until Rosenbaum has his hand on the gun. Doesn't fire on Huber until Huber has his hand on the gun. Doesn't fire on Grosskreutz until the Glock is pointed at his face. So you couldn't have exercised more self-discipline than he did. And a lot of people in that kind of chaotic, violent circumstance, being threatened by a riotous mob trying to lynch you. I mean, they were screaming in the crowd, cranium the boy, cranium the boy, cranium the boy. So you have a whole riotous mob trying to kill you. And the main reason he was there that night, and he had certain reactions, is he was very idealistic. He couldn't imagine people wanting to harm him. He's there to help protect people, to put out fires, to has medic treatment to treat people. How could he? And he just had his gun, thinking that will deter people. What crazy person would run at me when I have a gun? What crazy person would try to bash my head in when I have a gun? He just didn't know how criminal the sociopaths were that night that he was dealing with.
Okay, so how long was he actually in jail for after he was arrested?
Several months, because he was awaiting extradition from Illinois to Wisconsin. Now, part of that was a function of his defense team, this John Pierce guy being involved. And a lot of his case has been kind of hijacked by this David Hancock guy, a security guy, basically took over the kid's life and the family's life because they're a poor family. So the family ended up depending on Hancock to pay the bills. And they originally picked John Pierce to defend him, and he did a very there was no need to fight extradition in the way he was doing it. But to give an example of how traumatic it was for Kyle, he spent the first 3 weeks in jail vomiting every night, because that's how traumatic the entire incident was for him. Was horrified that anyone died. He has severe post-traumatic stress disorder.
Of course, yeah.
That's come out at trial. And when he broke down early in the trial and his testimony and had a clear PTSD panic attack moment.
He's 17 too. He's a kid.
Just a kid. He's now 18, but he's 17 at the time. Just a kid with, and not a kid who's a gangbanger who's been, practicing criminality from the age of 10. That's not who he is. He has no experience with this world, no familiarity with this world. He experiences anybody that knows anybody with PTSD could feel for the kid when he was going through that live on the stand. But what was the reaction of people like LeBron James? It was to make fun of him on Twitter and to mock him on Twitter. So, I mean, that's the world in which we exist, where the statist left is of such a certain mindset that they want to lock up an innocent kid to strip the rest of us of our self-defense rights in America.
I'm just sitting here wondering what Alec Baldwin has to do with all this.
When people say that a gun, when the prosecutor is trying to suggest that Grosskreutz couldn't cause harm with his gun just because it was a smaller gun, well, you can look to Alec Baldwin as to what can happen.
As an attorney and as just someone with a rational mind, what was going? Is it when a prosecutor says something that's that absurd, that like, well, the gun is smaller, it's a Glock, even if it's a 22, it doesn't, you know what I mean? Or a BB gun. A BB gun can certainly cause grievous injury to somebody. Is that the kind of thing where they actually believe their own crap, or are they just saying what they need to say to get the conviction?
It's both, I think, in this case.
Okay.
There's a part of it which he's convinced himself of this lie. But to give an example, in closing argument, he actually told people you can't kill someone if you don't have a gun or a knife. It's like, what? We've been killing people with our bare fist and our feet for centuries since human beings walked on the planet. But he actually made that statement to the jury. So and that's a patent lie, and he has to know it's a lie because he's prosecuted people for killing people with nothing more than their hands.
Or a skateboard.
Oh yeah, or
easily.
Skateboard. Absolutely, a skateboard is it's like 10 hammers put together.
Yeah.
In one. I mean, so it's ludicrous statements, but they're statements meant to appeal to a certain audience on that potential jury, which was amazing when we polled it. There was about a third of Kenosha that would not acquit no matter what, because they were committed to the idea that he shouldn't have been there, that him even being there was wrong. And that's what's most terrifying about this. Any conviction would reward the media for inflaming the court of public opinion on false facts, but it would also mean not only is self-defense seriously in jeopardy, it would mean you're not allowed to disagree with the left, period. Disagreeing with the left has become a crime.
Hey guys, Michael Malice here. You might know me as a terrible podcaster, incomprehensible author, and a real piece of crap on Twitter, but I'm also an underwear model. And the underwear I model is Sheath underwear. Sheath underwear is the best underwear you are ever going to wear. Why? Because it's very special. They've got dual pouch technology for both parts of your boy parts, one for one for the other. First time you try it on, you're going to be like, what is this? And then you're going to swear to it. If you go to sheathunderwear.com and use promo code MALICE, you get 20% off. You get added comfort, you get added performance, you get added mobility. And there's something a little subversive about having a conversation with someone while your underwear is cupping your junk. Trust me on this one. Every episode I'm talking to someone like Dave Smith, I'm sitting here in my sheath. If you go to sheathunderwear.com, use promo code MALICE, you get 20% off, and you'll be one step closer to being a stud like myself, or a stud who's an actual stud.
This is Walk-Ins Welcome with Bridget Pedicy.
I love hearing people's stories of resilience and grit. This is why I created this podcast.
We are very excited to welcome Jim Gaffigan, Yasmin Mohammed, Glenn Beck, Tim Dillon, Abigail Schreier, Jeff Garland, Ayan Hirsi Ali, Sam Harris, Heather Hying, Jonah Goldberg, Ben Shapiro, Glenn Greenwald, Sarah Shahi, Colin Quinn.
If there's a culture of victimhood, then let's tell stories of grit and survival.
Subscribe and listen now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
To get a conviction, how many charges are against him currently pending?
So he has a bunch of lesser included offenses included as well. So there's three homicide charges, which there's intentional homicide, attempted intentional homicide, second degree homicide, and reckless homicide, as all of those as a lesser included. Then there's also 2 reckless endangerment charges. Both the gun charge and the curfew charge were dismissed as a matter of law because there was no evidence to support it. The two reckless endangerment charges, one is Richie McGinnis, that him shooting at Rosenbaum endangered him. And the other one was the jump kick man. That was the guy who tried to kick him on the head. And because he shot around him, he ran off. By the way, he never even testified in the court. So you have two supposed victims, Richie McGinnis, who said Rittenhouse didn't endanger him, and the other one who has never testified. I mean, you never hear of cases going to a jury where there's no complaining witness, or the witness has said he's not complaining. And yet that's what we have in this case.
Does he need, for conviction, does he need a majority of the jury or a unanimity?
Unanimous. They have to have 12-0, agree beyond a reasonable doubt, and self-defense is a burden of the government to disprove. So the government has to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt that he didn't have self-defense in what he did that night.
So Kyle only needs one person on that jury to be like, F this is complete crap. I'm sitting on my hands. This is not over my dead body.
Correct. And that's why jury selection was so critical in this case. And that's where I disagreed and broke off with the current defense. Is my view was you needed to make sure you got people on that jury that presumed Kyle innocent, because you would have people on that jury who would fight for those beliefs in case other people got onto that jury, and would guarantee at a minimum a mistrial and no convictions. Ideally, if you pick the right jury, a jury of 12 people who's like, let's say they came in with your position, you think maybe he's guilty based on what you've heard, but you're open-minded. What we found is that juror group acquitted every time, because when they saw the facts, they were shocked by the disparity between what they've been told and what the facts actually showed. The only jury that would convict is a jury that came in politically motivated to convict no matter what. And hopefully that person is not on the jury, but I don't know, because they picked the jury in basically a day. In the McMichael case, they took 2 weeks. On average, you would take 2 weeks in a case like this. So I think they got a random jury, and Kyle just has to hope he gets a little bit lucky with it.
So let's look at both scenarios, how they shake out. Let's suppose that he is convicted. Does he have rights to appeal?
Yes, and because in my view, there should have been a mistrial with prejudice motion granted middle of the proceedings, number one. Number two, illicit evidence was admitted. They actually introduced, we not only had super chats admitted, which may have been plain error, even though the defense didn't make a timely objection. We had YouTube commentators' evidence admitted, third-party prejudicial hearsay admitted in violation of the Confrontation Clause. We had the prosecutor making repeated acts of misconduct, suborning perjury, trying to suborn perjury, making statements about his Fifth Amendment rights in violation of his constitutional rights, violating pretrial court orders about inadmissible prejudicial evidence. So questionable jury instructions on provocation and duty to retreat. And last but not least, false statements of fact and law he made in closing argument. So in my view, that aggregate provides a robust appeal in case of conviction.
Where would the appeal be heard?
So first go to the Wisconsin court. First, he would kind of with the trial court. They could ask the trial court to set aside the verdict for all of those reasons. They could also ask the trial court to give him bail pending appeal. Mm-hmm. And this trial court has been overtly hostile to the prosecutor because of the prosecutor's misconduct and because of his doubts about the wisdom of this prosecution from the inception. Then you'd go up to the Wisconsin Court of Appeals. You have a right of appeal there. And then you have a permissive right to go to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, which should lean rightward by the time Kyle's appeal got there, if that were ever to occur. Then up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Even after that, you have another round in both state court and even federal court on habeas grounds. I think he has an ineffective assistance of counsel claim because his defense lawyers did a basically incompetent job throughout large parts of the trial. And you may have new evidence issues because in this case, they actually used computer-aided images to create a fake image. They pretended that Kyle pointed the gun right before Rosenbaum ran at him at the beginning. It's based on an enhanced image that's a fake image. It's not the actual image. You see it didn't happen. Totally made up. But the court allowed this evidence in without competent expert testimony to be able to support it. So that, too, would be evidentiary grounds to review.
Who would be the one to sentence him? Would it be the judge?
Yes, the trial court judge. And given his comments to date, people assume this trial court would be sympathetic with Kyle's position legally and sympathetic. He's already said that the prosecutor engaged in bad faith misconduct in the case, which is the legal standard to dismiss with prejudice. So he can always revisit that even after a jury verdict. And he would also control sentencing.
Is it possible that the sentence would be something like time served or, a suspended sentence?
Yes.
Okay.
And in fact, the belief by local media is that especially if Kyle only gets hit with the reckless endangerment, if they do what I call a split verdict or a compromise verdict,
Yeah.
that they don't believe that this judge will sentence Kyle to any additional time beyond that he's already served.
If he gets off on all the charges, is he in a position to pull a Nicholas Sandman, in your legal opinion, and sue some of these media agencies that have accused him of just really horrific things?
It's very, very hard. So he
Okay.
could sue them and win on liability grounds. So Joe Scarborough, the Young Turks, Ben and Jerry's, when they made a specific factually false statement, like he crossed state lines with a gun
Right.
illegally, that was patently false, was known to be false, was grossly reckless, was actual malice, to play on words, to get there. And so he could win on liability. The problem is damages. What's his
Okay.
real harm? His harm is the criminal prosecution. Because of that independent act, it's brutally hard for people falsely accused of crimes in America by prosecutors to ever recover for libel claims simply because of the prosecution itself.
Okay. So it's not like he lost his job or something like that, where they could say, I lost my job or I lost my inheritance or something, where there's a tangible.
And even if you did, the argument for the defense would be that was because of the criminal prosecution, not
Right.
because of the libel.
Is there any possibility of any consequences for this prosecutor?
I hope so. I'm leading an effort. It was briefly trending, even on Twitter, despite its efforts to suppress information about this case, disbar Binger. So I want an effort to be brought. I know the head of the Office of Lawyer Regulation in Wisconsin. This kind of prosecutorial malfeasance and misconduct has to stop at some point. And if a prosecutor can do this in such a high-profile case without consequence, then it says that the Wisconsin Office of Lawyer Regulation is a joke, because they go after dissident lawyers all the time.
Oh, they do? Okay.
Small scale criminal defense lawyers, politically controversial lawyers, family lawyers, those kind of lawyers, street lawyers. They need to hold prosecutors to account. Here's a prosecutor who a judge found engaged in bad faith misconduct that violated a client's constitutional rights. That has to have remedy. At a minimum, Binger should be suspended. He should be fired from his job and suspended from the practice of law for at least a year. So
this organization, this agency that you're referring to, they're the ones who are in a position to have consequences for him for his job and for his license.
Correct. The Wisconsin Supreme Court ultimately controls it, but they delegate that function to the Office of Lawyer Regulation. I've always had a bit of a problem with the courts controlling that process, but it's the way it works.
So how often does a prosecutor get disbarred or get suspended?
Almost never. So there was a study done in 2,000 prior instances where a court found a prosecutor engaged in affirmative misconduct. Already very rare that ever occurs. Judges find every excuse in the world to excuse prosecutorial conduct. In only 2 of those 2,000 cases did any prosecutor face any discipline at all.
I mean, at the very least, I'm glad that people are understanding how, because we all have our idea of how cops work by watching NYPD Blue. We think the legal system, because people watch Matlock or LA Law or whatever the kids watch these days. And then this is for the first time in history, or it's certainly to this extent, where there's cameras in the courtroom and people can, back when we were kids, you'd have the 3 networks. They didn't have the bandwidth to cover a court case for days on end, right? Now that you have cable news and the internet, there's infinite bandwidth to watch a case every hour. And all it takes is one set of eyes to keep track of this, like the show Big Brother, right? Just that one person has to be up at 4 in the morning to watch that person make that comment. And very quickly it can spread and people become educated and aware of just how it works in real life, as opposed to how it's portrayed in a movie with Ben Affleck or someone playing the prosecutor.
Exactly. To show you how effective it's been in this case, Nick Rekieta has been doing live streams of the trial with legal commentary from a panel of lawyers who is more informative than your conventional CNN lawyer. It was so impactful that today during closing arguments, YouTube summarily suspended his live stream.
No, they didn't.
Yes. And it was only because of massive outrage on social media that they reinstated it. But
on what grounds did they suspend him?
They kept changing the grounds. First, it was privacy. And it was like, this is a public trial. How's the privacy issue? Then it was a copyright issue. It's like, there is no copyright issue. This is a court feed that there's public rights.
Yeah, it's public, right? It's like C-SPAN. Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. So they went through, and then I think they had a third excuse. And when they realized all 3 were failing, they reinstated it. But only because of the massive backlash on social media did they otherwise. They otherwise planned on taking it down so that people would have to watch the CNN version of events.
But I think, Robert, you made a very important point. If they had their druthers, they would have taken him down, and they didn't. Same thing when they tried to take down Parler. People don't realize this. They did take it down successfully after January 6th, but it was up and running, I think, again in 6 weeks. So no one is denying it. Certainly, I'm not denying that the forces behind what I hate the term big tech, if they had their druthers, would do things in a certain way, but they're not omnipotent. They're not omnipotent even when it comes to their own product. And especially something like this, where this isn't, me at my house, some jackass with a microphone. These are attorneys and a group of attorneys who are providing real-time commentary, which would be of enormous public interest. I'm not an attorney. I'm watching a trial. What am I watching? Please inform me. Please educate me. And of course, this is a big threat to the powers that be, because it's very disadvantageous for them to have an educated populace, because then that educated populace will be able to spot their bullshit on sight.
Exactly. It's the power. I always tell people the court of public opinion often matters more than anything else. And if you can, and you don't need 50%, you just need a committed group of involved people. That if you have a committed group of involved people, you can change the world. I remember having this discussion with a prosecutor in Maine about 10 years ago in a state criminal tax prosecution. And he said, look, I got to go after your client, even though your client is really being targeted for political reasons, because if his beliefs catch on, all the lobstermen are going to join in, and if I get to 20% non-compliance with a particular state policy, I'm done. And I was like, well, what happens if I go and win in a high profile public trial? I'll get you that 20% in 24 hours and you're screwed. So we did a negotiation at that point. But so it's critical that people recognize that, because that's the pushback. We're seeing it on vaccine mandates. You even have Scott Gottlieb, Mr. former FDA, Pfizer board member, whining now himself about vaccine mandates, saying, look at how this is backfiring. We're getting a record number of people oppose these mandates, a record number of people questioning the wisdom of what Big Pharma is up to, a record number of people questioning the way these policies work, a record number of people questioning whether government should even have this power to dictate your private medicine in the first place. Yeah, that's what you get. That's what you get when you have bad policies. But more importantly, it's what you get when the court of public opinion pushes back in a meaningful way.
No, that's what you get. And I know you're not going to disagree with me, when you start going after the kids. Yes. And I think that's what happened in Virginia, that when they start targeting the children, which they have to do because they have to perpetuate their, ruling elite, and you have to do it by training the next generation of good citizens. Once people are aware they're coming after your kids, why is my 5-year-old be getting a shot every 6 months? It's certainly not going to feel nice for the kid. It's going to be very upsetting to get a shot. We all were kids. We all got shots. We didn't like it. If this is the argument that your kid is going to get a shot for a disease that they can't really get in perpetuity for 6 months, there's going to be a sizable percentage of the population, regardless of the ideology, it says, no, this is my line. Like, keep that away from my kid, and I'll take the risk of my kid not getting symptoms and somehow getting me sick, and I'm not going to die either.
It's what I've been telling my friends, is that it turns out religious homeschoolers and vaccine skeptics have been right all along, and we're all discovering the deeper truth of what they're doing. People are finally waking up that public education is indoctrination, not education. It's never been about giving you the skill sets to survive in life. It's about acculturating you to a certain mindset that is of the state's mindset. And people are waking up to how radical some of those idolatry of ideology actually is.
Robert, running out of time, what has been your favorite part of this interview?
Favorite part? Well, just getting the chance to defend Kyle in the court of public opinion. He's an innocent kid from a poor family the system tried to crush. And the more the rest of us push back, the more he has a chance at justice, regardless of what the jury does. But it can impact his ability to get that too. So that's what matters most. Being able to defend vulnerable people when powerful people try to crush them is why I entered the practice of law. And Kyle's case is emblematic of that.
Case closed.